Hello, future world changers, and here's your lesson on ecological succession. So in 1998, before y'all were born, Yellowstone was burned. Almost over a third of the park was burned in forest fires. It sparked public outrage. They were upset that our oldest national park had succumbed to fires in such a drastic way. And so lots of trees died, there was ash everywhere, and the forest looked pretty bad. The news had a field day with it, um, talking about how our fire suppression or putting out wildfires had caused the fires in Yellowstone to become huge. The next spring, though, much of the forest floor was covered in grasses and wildflowers that poked up through the ash. And then within 10 years, the fire burned areas looked a lot like the area on the photo at the right. Maybe not quite as tall of trees, but lots of baby lodgepole pines were growing up. And one thing many people in the general public don't realize is that fire is an important part of many forest ecosystems, especially lodgepole pine forest ecosystems. In lodgepole pine forests, the cones actually don't reseed on the ground without a lot of heat. The heat opens up the cones and lets the seeds come out. So all of that baby lodgepole pine growing in that photo on the right is because of the heat of the fires opening up the cones and reseeding new lodgepole pine. So there is a video that I will link to below that kind of gives you more detail on these Yellowstone fires and how they regrew after. So succession is defined in ecology as the replacement of one type of community by another at a single location at a period of time. So one thing to remember is that ecosystems aren't stable. They seem like it on a human scale, but over tens to hundreds of years, ecosystems should be changing. It's hard to see because trees take a long time to grow, pretty much a lifetime for most trees to reach full maturity for you and I. And so watching that happen, it takes time. And we don't always visit the same place over and over to see succession happen. There's two types of succession, primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession starts in an area where other organisms previously haven't lived. So it takes a really catastrophic event to present brand new land that hasn't had organisms there to start growing. So this might occur because of glacial retreat. It might occur because of a new island forming from a volcano or other similar events. And when we talk about primary succession, one of the things we talk about is pioneer species. And so a pioneer species is a species that colonizes an uninhabited area and starts the process of succession. So in primary succession, the species is typically lichen. So here is the order of primary succession. We start off with bare rock and nothing is living there. Then the lichens come. And lichens grip onto rocks and they actually secrete a little bit of acid, and that acid breaks the rocks down into smaller and smaller particles. And these particles mix with the remains of dead lichens and we start to see soil forming. And that's going to be the key, is how long it takes to form soil. And soil science is something you can major in college. It's that important to us as humans. But yeah, we're looking at the formation of soil. So it all starts with bare rocks and lichens coming. And then step 3 is after the lichens have been there for a while and there's some really minimal soils forming, the mosses start to grow. And eventually the mosses outcompete the lichens, or they might both be there. And as the mosses die and break down rock more and more things are added to the soil, and you might start to see insects and other tiny organisms living among the mosses. And then as the soil deepens and over more and more time, the mosses would be replaced by ferns, and the ferns would slowly be replaced by grasses and wildflowers. And then if there is enough soil, shrubs and small trees may grow. So notice at the bottom of this picture, we're talking about hundreds of years for this to happen. So longer than your lifetime or mine. And after hundreds of years, the soil may be deep enough and stable enough to start to support a forest. So secondary succession is more of what happened in Yellowstone. So sometimes an existing community is destroyed by natural disaster, such as a fire or a flood, or even clear-cutting a forest. And if the soil's left intact, the original community could regrow through a series of stages that we're going to call secondary succession. In the first year after the disturbance, the annual plants start to grow. And annual plants are plants that have to get reseeded every year. So they come back first. And then in the next few years, the grasses and perennials will start to grow in the disturbed area. So we're just seeing some basic ground cover coming back first. And then in 5 to 15 years, small pine trees or conifers may start growing along with other shrubs. And then the trees will continue to grow, and after roughly 100 years, you probably start to see a forest form. And then as the older conifers or pine trees die, they may be replaced by hardwoods like oaks, maples, trees like that, the deciduous trees with the broad leaves, if the climate can support them. And so that might be the climax community. But each ecosystem has its own climax community, and it can look really different depending on where you're at, as you are learning about in your ecology projects. So in the early stages of succession, there's only a few species in a given area. But as the community matures, it's going to be dominated by well-adapted, slow-growing climax species. So these are going to start to take over, and it's going to take time. And as succession proceeds, you're going to get more and more species. And so that's important because the variety of species present in an area is called biodiversity, and having lots of biodiversity, meaning many species present in an area, typically reflects good ecosystem health. So with lots of biodiversity becomes an increased ability to withstand things like disease, wildflower, or invasion of insects. If you have a forest that is all one type of tree and a particular insect comes that attacks that tree, you can wipe out thousands upon thousands of acres of that forest. And some of this is what's happening with bark beetles in the Intermountain West, in the mountains. So having that biodiversity, having some stands of lodgepole pine and some stands of ponderosa pine, and then some of subalpine fir and mixed forests of all of those can be really beneficial to an ecosystem. And the mature community for an ecosystem may not always be a forest. So if we think of the desert, there are spots in the desert where there really aren't many trees. And so the mature community may be a community of shrubs. And sometimes it is a forest, and sometimes it's grasses, like in the Great Plains. So, yeah, I think the big takeaways from this lesson are that ecosystems are constantly changing and evolving and hopefully adding to their biodiversity. Primary succession happens where there was no plant life before, and secondary succession happens after a disturbance to an area, but where there's still plant life, and that ecology is pretty fascinating. So thanks for listening.